Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now this is the Nvidia T600. You may remember that we took a look at the T400 a while ago, which looks identical but has weaker specs. The T600 is another RTX professional GPU. It's got double the VRAM, more cores, and best of all I paid just £129 for it in a sale on the Lenovo website. Today we're going to be testing its gaming performance. It's not designed for gaming, but like the weaker T400 it can play games. So let's start off with some comparisons to the aforementioned weaker card. In GTA 5 the T600 will perform really well in terms of an average frame rate, and it blows the cheaper 2GB T400 out of the water in this regard. However, I did notice some significant frame dips which pretty much made the game unplayable in busier areas. This is easily fixable, and we'll get onto that a little later on. Cyberpunk, with 70% of 1080p at low, runs with a 50fps average. Again, this exceeds the T400's performance by about 14fps, and the game certainly feels a lot more playable. The percentile figures aren't all that different, but overall the extra power of this card is noticeable here. For a final comparison with the T400, I fired up Red Dead Redemption 2. Unlike the T400, which limited us in terms of visual quality settings because of the VRAM, it's clear that we can push the quality settings further this time around, and we will be doing so later on. DLSS is also usable here because this is part of the RTX family after all, but again, like with the T400, performance is negatively impacted because I don't think it's fully supported on a hardware level. With the T600 clearly a far more capable product then than its baby brother, it's time to see what it can really do. Forza Horizon 5 ran with 60fps at the medium settings. The only change I made was turning MSAA off and turning FXAA on, which gave us a few extra frames and helped keep the average above 60. 68 was actually the average frame rate though. All we were really doing was driving through some towns and part of the jungle, which to be honest I suppose can be quite intensive and cause some dips with performance. Although the percentile lows both state around 30 here, I never really saw the frame rate dip this low with my own eyes. It did seem to drop, but it didn't really go below 55, but I guess the numbers, well, they speak for themselves. Let's just say that it feels a lot better to play than these figures would suggest. Battlefield 2042 is a mixed bag. The best option here is to play at 900p with the low preset or the low settings across the board. Doing this will mean a 60fps average, but the percentile lows can differ significantly depending on the map you are playing and whereabouts on the map you are. Now don't get me wrong, it's nothing game breaking, but it can be a little bit annoying, and some maps will run a little smoother than others, and some will run a lot smoother and barely stutter at all. What I've done here then is taken an average across 3 online games, but the footage you are seeing is from an AI match for convenience sake. The result is pretty decent considering that this is a workstation card. A cheap one at that, well, sometimes anyway. Returning to a classic now with The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, I decided to treat myself to medium graphical options here, as well as post-processing settings. I did turn sharpening off as well as blur and motion blur though. That's all personal preference. We couldn't quite hit 60fps on average, not in Novigrad anyway, but I feel that we are getting a nice balance between visual fidelity and performance here. What a great little card this is turning out to be. In Far Cry 6 I went for the low settings yet again, but I kept FSR off and also decided not to touch the resolution scaling option. This means that we are running at a native 1080p low, and while we're not quite hitting 60 yet again, performance is better than I thought it would be. For 60fps, utilising FSR or turning the native resolution down to 900p would be your best bet, but I'm fairly happy with things as they are here. If you're watching this video and you are someone who is fine with 30 frames per second, then this card will be able to offer that easily at this resolution with even higher settings. That doesn't just go for this game either. We're going to return to Night City now, but this time we'll be utilising 900p native instead of a 70% scaling option, but we will be remaining with the low settings to avoid dips below 30. Even with this native res, a decent average is achievable. We would have had to sacrifice too much in the way of visuals for 60 frames per second, requiring 720p and maybe even lower scaling for a consistent FPS, so I decided to settle with 900p and a frame rate that is still pretty decent considering the demanding nature of this game and the non-gaming purpose of the card. In Fortnite I used 1080p medium settings with 100% scaling. Performance mode will provide the best results, but there's no need to sacrifice the fancier visuals when we can hit almost 100 FPS anyway. Low settings will get you over 120. In the UK, this card usually retails at around £180 to £200, which I think is a fair price for what it is during these current times. If you can find it in a sale from an OEM retailer, then even better, and although you might be put off by its name and the fact that it is a professional GPU on paper, well, you shouldn't let that dissuade you completely, because like a lot of these professional cards, well, it may surprise you. I jumped back on my horse and fired up Red Dead for a second time. I mean, in game, I didn't get on an actual horse and then I didn't need to explain that. I then made use of the console equivalent settings. These included ultra textures. The game runs at 30 FPS or close to it on every platform that isn't PC, and as someone who completed this on the PS4 base console, anything over 30 FPS at 1920 by 1080 is always a welcome outcome. Thankfully, we could squeeze 36 out of the T600 and the percentile figures were also quite solid. There will be no nasty stutters here, and with Red Dead being a slow-paced third-person adventure, I'm always happy to play at 30. Now you might think entirely differently of course and want to stick to lower settings in an attempt to maintain 60 FPS. I mentioned at the start that GTA had some stuttering issues and that I was going to talk about fixing them. The easiest way to do this is just to enable MSAA. I set it to 2x here, and I've also increased the detail sliders to halfway and switched the texture quality to high. Even so, we still got a plus 100 FPS average with respectable 1.1% lows. Now I'm not sure why enabling MSAA got rid of the frame time spikes, but there we go. For our final game test, I went with another new release, and one that I've been looking forward to playing. This is Halo Infinite. MSI Afterburner doesn't work here, so I had to use Microsoft's built-in resource monitor, which is honestly pretty good. I set it to run at 71% of 1080p, which was as low as I could go on a native 1080p display, and the resolution works out at about 1363 by 767, so it's basically like playing on a native 1366 by 768 television. I also disabled high-res textures in Steam, which can be done by right-clicking on the game's properties and disabling the option under downloadable content, or DLC. I haven't tried the game with this option enabled yet, so I can't tell how much of a difference there's going to be, but we were seeing over 60 FPS pretty much all of the time with it disabled. To conclude, the T600 is a decent entry-level RTX Pro card for gaming. I have no idea how good it is as a workstation card, but in this case it did pretty well. As you know, it's not intended for gaming, but it can do it, and thanks to its 4 gigs of GDDR6 VRAM and increased core count, well, it rings around the T400, the weaker of the two. The price of the card varies from place to place, but during these uncertain times and GPU shortages, as well as overpriced hardware, perhaps this is an option that you might want to consider if you have less to spend. With all that said then, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed it, leave a like, leave a dislike if you didn't, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.